Imagine a 17-year-old girl, illiterate, the daughter of peasants, leading the most powerful army in Europe against invaders who had dominated her country for decades. Impossible. That's exactly what happened in 1429. Joan of Arc was not a trained warrior. She had no military experience, and yet in just 1 year, she changed the destiny of France and Europe forever. But how did a peasant girl manage to do the impossible? And why, after saving her nation, was she burned alive at the age of 19? To understand Joan of Arc, we need to go back to the year 1337. The 100 Years' War had begun, a brutal conflict between France and England for control of the French throne. In 1429, when our story begins, the situation in France was desperate. England controlled practically half of French territory. Paris was occupied by English troops. The rightful King Charles VII had not even been crowned, and the population was exhausted after decades of war, famine, and the Black Death. The English seemed invincible. Their victories at Crécy and Agincourt were legendary. France was on the verge of total collapse, and it was in this moment of absolute darkness that a 16-year-old girl emerged from an unknown village, Domremy, a small village in the Lorraine region. It is here that Joan of Arc was born in 1412, daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, simple and pious peasants. Joan was an ordinary girl. She tended sheep, helped with household chores, and went to church. But at the age of 13, something extraordinary happened. According to her own account in court, Joan began to hear voices. They were not just any voices. She identified them as Saint Michael, the Archangel, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. And these voices had a mission for her. You must go to the Dauphin Charles, help him to be crowned king in Reims, and expel the English from France. Imagine an illiterate teenage girl receiving divine orders to lead armies and crown kings. For 3 years, Joan resisted. How could she do it? It was impossible. But the voices persisted. And in 1428, with France on the brink of total collapse, Joan made the decision that would change everything. In May 1428, Joan did something unthinkable for a peasant girl. She left her family and went to Vaucouleurs, the nearest fortress still loyal to France. There she sought out Captain Robert de Baudricourt and said, "I need to see the Dauphin. God has sent me to save France." Baudricourt expelled her. He called her mad. But Joan did not give up. She returned, and she returned again. Her determination was so strong, her conviction so absolute, that something began to change. Soldiers began to believe in her. The people saw her as a divine sign. Finally, in February 1429, Baudricourt relented. He gave her a sword, an escort of 6 men, and men's clothing for the journey. The trip to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles was 11 days through enemy territory. 450 kilometers of pure danger. But Joan arrived. And what happened next is almost impossible to believe. Charles VII, the Dauphin, was not exactly an inspiring leader. Weak, indecisive, constantly doubting his own legitimacy to the throne. Some even doubted he was the legitimate son of the previous king. When Joanna arrived at Chinon Castle, Charles decided to test her. He exchanged clothes with a nobleman and hid among the court crowd. Joanna had never seen the king. There were no photos, no accessible portraits. But when she entered the hall, she went straight to him. She ignored the impostor on the throne and knelt before Charles, hidden among the courtiers. "Noble Dauphin," she said, "I have come in the name of the King of Heaven to help you recover your kingdom." Carlos was stunned. How had she recognized him? But the test wasn't over. Carlos took her to a private room, and according to historical accounts, Joanna revealed something to him that only he knew. A secret prayer he had made, asking God for a sign that he was the rightful heir. No one knows exactly what Joanna said at that moment, but when they left the room, Carlos was transformed. He believed. But believing in Joan was one thing. Putting her in command of an army was quite another. Charles gathered theologians and clergymen in Poitiers to examine her for 3 weeks. They questioned her about everything: her faith, her visions, her intentions. Joan answered with devastating simplicity. When asked if God needed soldiers to liberate France, she replied, "The soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory." The examiners found nothing heretical in her. They approved her mission. Joan then received a complete suit of white armor made to measure, a white banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary, an army of 4,000 men, and something crucial: official legitimacy as the future king of France. But the first challenge would be almost impossible. The city of Orléans had been under siege by the English for 6 months. It was the last major French city on the way south. If Orléans fell, France was lost, and that was where Joan would march. April 1429. Joan arrives on the outskirts of Orléans with her army. The situation was critical. The city was surrounded by English fortresses on all sides. The inhabitants were starving, the French soldiers demoralized, and the English were superior in number and position. Traditional military strategy would say it is impossible to break this siege. But Joan did not follow traditional strategy. First, she did something that shocked the commanders. She sent a letter to the English, not a common threat of war, but a religious ultimatum. King of England, do justice to the King of Heaven. Surrender the keys to all the good cities you have taken. I have come from God to reclaim royal blood. I am ready to make peace if you will do justice, and if you will not, I am a warlord, and wherever I find your men in France, I will make them leave, whether they like it or not." The English laughed. They called her a witch, a prostitute, a sorceress. That was their biggest mistake. On April 29th, Joan entered Orléans with reinforcements of supplies and soldiers. The population erupted in joy. Finally, hope. But the veteran generals doubted. Jean de Dunois, the commander of the defense, planned a cautious, long-term strategy. Joan had other plans: an immediate and aggressive attack. May 4th, 1429, the first attack. Joan personally led the assault on the fort of Saint-Loup, one of the English fortifications. The French soldiers, inspired by her presence, fought with a ferocity they hadn't shown in years. Saint-Loup fell in a few hours, but it was only the beginning. In the following days, fort after fort, Joan led attacks against English positions. Les Augustins was taken on May 6th. Les Tourelles, the most important fort guarding the bridge over the Loire River, would be next, May 7th. The Battle of Les Tourelles would be the decisive moment. Joan was on the front line, banner in hand, when it happened. An English arrow pierced her shoulder, between her neck and chest. She fell. The French soldiers panicked. Their leader had fallen. Joan was carried behind the lines. The arrow was removed, some say by herself. The pain was unbearable. Commanders suggested retreating, waiting for another day. Joan refused. After praying briefly, she rose, took her banner, and returned to the battle. "When my banner touches the wall, come in." What happened next became legend. Witnesses recount that Joan, still bleeding, led the final assault. When her banner touched the walls of Les Tourelles, the French erupted in a furious attack. The English, who had dominated France for decades, broke. They fled in panic. On May 8th, after 9 days of intense fighting, the siege of Orléans was broken. The impossible had happened. English losses were devastating. More importantly, their myth of invincibility was shattered. Orléans was just the beginning. Joan had a greater goal: to bring Charles VII to Reims, to be officially crowned. But between Orléans and Reims lay enemy territory and English armies. June 1429, the Loire campaign. In just 1 month, Joan led a series of impressive victories. Battle of Jargeau on June 12th, total victory. Battle of Meung-sur-Loire on June 15th, capture of the city. Battle of Beaugency on June 16th and 17th, English surrender. Battle of Patay on June 18th, the greatest victory. Patay was especially brutal for the English. The French army, led by Joan, completely destroyed. An English force of 5,000 men, only 2,000 survived. In 6 weeks, Joan had done what experienced generals had failed to do in decades, completely turned the tide of the war. The road to Reims was open. July 17th, 1429, Reims Cathedral. This cathedral was not just a church, it was the sacred place where all French kings had traditionally been crowned since the year 816. Charles VII was anointed and crowned King of France, a ceremony that seemed impossible months before. And beside him, holding his banner, was Joan of Arc, the 17-year-old peasant girl who made it all possible. When asked why her banner deserved to be in the ceremony, Joan replied simply, "It was present at the work. It is only right that it should have a place in the honor." The mission the voices had given her was complete. France had its rightful king. The English were in retreat. Joan asked permission to return home to her family. Charles refused. He still needed her. It was the beginning of the end. After the coronation, everything began to change. Charles VII, now officially king, began negotiating truces with Burgundy, allies of the English. Joan was against it. She wanted to continue fighting until she completely expelled the invaders. But the royal court saw Joan as a threat. She was too popular, too powerful, too independent. In September 1429, Joan led an attack on Paris, still occupied by the English. It was a disaster. She was wounded again, this time in the thigh, and the attack failed. Charles ordered a retreat. The military campaign was officially over. During the winter of 1429-1430, Joan remained with the army, but increasingly isolated. The king no longer consulted her. The nobility avoided her. And then, May 23, 1430, during a minor skirmish in Compiègne, Burgundian forces surrounded Joan. She was the last to retreat, covering the escape of her soldiers. She was captured. What followed was a betrayal that would shock Europe. Joan of Arc, the heroine who saved France, was a prisoner. The normal protocol would be, the king pays a ransom, his heroine returns home. Charles VII did nothing. For 4 months, Joan remained in Burgundian captivity. She attempted to escape twice, including a desperate leap from a 20-meter tower. She survived, but was recaptured. In November 1430, the Burgundians sold Joan. The buyer, the English. Price, $10,000. A fortune. Why did the English want her so badly? It wasn't just revenge. If they could prove that Joan was a witch, a heretic, a sorceress, then all their victories would be the work of the devil. Charles VII would not be the legitimate king, but someone crowned by satanic forces. It was a political trial disguised as a religious court, and Joan, alone and abandoned, would have to face it. January 9th, 1431. Joan is transferred to Rouen in territory controlled by the English. Her trial would begin in February, conducted by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, and a staunch English ally. This would not be a fair trial. The rules were broken from the start. Joan was kept in chains in an English military prison, not an ecclesiastical one. She was not allowed a lawyer. The guards were hostile English men. She lived under constant threat of violence. The court had already decided the verdict before it even began. For 3 months, Joan was relentlessly interrogated. More than 70 judges and theologians tried to catch her in contradictions, to prove she was a heretic. But here's the extraordinary thing. A 19-year-old illiterate peasant girl confronted the greatest scholars of the church at the time and defended herself brilliantly. The transcripts of the trial still exist. They are 400 pages of questions and answers. Reading them today, 600 years later, Joan's intelligence and courage are impressive. They asked, "Are you in a state of grace?" It was a trap. If she said yes, it would be arrogance, only God knows. If she said no, she would be admitting to being a sinner. Joan's answer, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." The theologians were speechless. A perfect answer. They asked, "Does God hate the English?" Joan replied. "Of the love or hatred that God has for the English, I know nothing, but I know that they will be expelled from France, except those who die here, defiant to the end." But they broke her in another way. Joanna was subjected to brutal psychological torture, constant threats of rape, sleep deprivation, total isolation, and the most serious accusation, wearing men's clothing was, according to the court, an abomination against God. Joanna explained she wore men's clothing for protection. In a prison full of hostile soldiers, it was her only defense against sexual violence. On May 24th, after weeks of unbearable pressure, Joanna gave in. She signed an abjuration, a partial retraction of her statements. She promised to stop wearing men's clothing. They thought they would save her from death. They changed her sentence to life imprisonment, but it was a trap. Days later, Joan was back in men's clothing. There are accounts that her guards stole her women's clothes, forcing her to choose between nudity and men's clothing. Others say she chose deliberately, a final statement of defiance. It doesn't matter. For the court, it was the evidence they needed. She had relapsed into heresy. The sentence was changed. Death at the stake. May 30th, 1431, Place du Vieux Marché, Rouen. Joan of Arc, at 19 years old, was led to the public square. Thousands attended, some to mock, others in silence to weep. Joan was tied to a tall stake, deliberately built high so that she would die slowly from the smoke, not from direct flames. Her last words were prayers. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by the scene, made a small wooden cross and gave it to her. Joan held the cross until the end. Witnesses recount that, as the flames rose, she repeatedly cried out, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," until silence fell. An English executioner, Jean Massieu, wept, openly afterward saying, "We burned a saint." Another, the executioner himself, was tormented until the end of his life, saying that he condemned his soul by executing someone clearly innocent. Joan's ashes were thrown into the Seine River so that there would be no relics, no place of pilgrimage. They wanted to erase her from history. They failed completely. Joan's death did not erase her memory. On the contrary, just 25 years later, in 1456, Pope Calixtus III ordered a new trial, a trial of rehabilitation. The verdict of 1431 was declared null and void. Joan was officially acquitted of all charges. Pierre Cauchon, the judge who condemned her, was declared a heretic. But Joan's redemption went further. In 1909, almost 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was beatified. In 1920, she was canonized, declared a saint by the Catholic Church. In 1922, she was proclaimed patron saint of France. The peasant girl burned as a heretic became a national symbol, a military heroine, and a saint of the Church. But Joan's true legacy lies not in titles. It lies in what she represents. Absolute courage in the face of the impossible, unwavering faith when everyone doubts, loyalty to principles above her own life, the ability of a single person to change history. A 17-year-old girl without training, without formal education, without the support of the elite, defied empires, led armies, changed the destiny of nations. And when everything was taken from her, when she was betrayed and abandoned, she did not break. She died shouting the name of the one in whom she believed. Today, more than 600 years later, Joan of Arc continues to fascinate the world. There are countless theories about her. Some see her as genuinely inspired by God. Others suggest psychological conditions such as schizophrenia. Historians debate whether she had temporal lobe epilepsy. Some see her simply as a brilliant military leader. The truth, we will never know for sure. But one thing is undeniable. At a time when France was broken, defeated, and hopeless, a young woman from the countryside appeared and said, "I can fix this. And she did. You saved your nation. You changed the history of Europe. You inspired millions throughout the centuries. And he paid the highest possible price for his courage. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the holy warrior, a peasant girl who faced empires and won. If you were impressed by Joan of Arc's story, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Next week we'll tell another impossible story. How 300 Spartans faced an army of hundreds of thousands at the Battle of Thermopylae. Leave a comment. Do you think Joan really heard divine voices? Or was there another explanation? Until the next battle.